My name is Carol Chandler. I'm a board member of the Lee County Genealogical and Historical Society, and I'm going to present a program this evening on the Orphan Trains. And I've called it the Orphan Trains, the history and the human side of the story. I became interested in the Orphan Trains back in 2008 when a good friend of mine was told by her mother that her grandmother came west on the Orphan Trains, and I had no idea what the Orphan Trains were. Piqued my interest, and so I decided to do a little research. Busy at the time, I put it in the back burner and started again about a year later. I feel this is a very, very interesting and very important part of our history in the Midwest. And it all started by a massive influx of migrants to the United States in the late 1850s and 1860s. Three causes of this massive immigration were the Irish potato famine, in which 2.5 million people either died or left the country. The second cause was the building of the Transcontinental Railroad. They had advertised all over Europe for a cheap labor force. This brought a lot of people to the United States. The third cause was the Homestead Act, the opening of the West. And of course, at this point in time, your land was your value. And so within about 10 years, 3,471,000 some odd people came into the United States. These people came over with nothing. Some of them got here by selling their indentureship to the ship's captain, and then he sold it again when they got here, and that's what paid for their crossing. Since they got here with nothing, and they left their support behind, their families were left behind, their parents, aunts, uncles, cousins, whatever, these people lived in what we would today call the ghetto. It was not uncommon to have 10 people living in a room. It was not uncommon to live in places that were not heated in the winter. Naturally, the illness and the death rates were extremely high. There were approximately 30,000 children living on the streets of New York at that time, and another 8,000 to 9,000 living on the streets in Boston, and those were the two main ports of entry were Boston and New York City. The main cause was either the passing away of the mother or the father. The mother passed away, the father could not support the children. The mother died, or the father died, and the mother could not support, or whatever. There were only about 7 orphanages in the United States at that time. Of course, the United States at that point was to the Mississippi. And so there were 30,000 some kids living in New York City, another 8,000 to 9,000 in Boston, living on the streets. They sold paper flowers, they sold newspapers, they sold rags, they shined shoes, they prostituted themselves. They stole whatever they could do to survive. And some of these groups were siblings. And so some of these children not only had a sibling role, but a parental role as well, because some of the older children were looking after the younger children. In 1853, a young minister came to New York. His name was Charles Loring Brace. He was appalled at what he saw, and with the encouragement of 6 businessmen, he founded the Children's Aid Society, which was the beginning of foster care in the United States. Now, Charles Loring Brace was a wonderful person, but he also thought boys were more important. He didn't think girls needed any education just to run a household or raise a family. And so he decided he would build a boarding house to house some of these boys and build a vocational school. Well, there's no way that you could meet the need. And so they decided, based on something that had been done in Europe for centuries, this indentureship program of sending children out to other families to learn a trade. Well, they thought, what with all of this demand for farm labor and domestic help in the West, which is what we were at that time, we were the West, and you have this surplus of kids who need homes on the East Coast. So they've got this idea that they're going to send some of these kids there. Give these kids a better chance at life and fulfill the need. They started the plan by selecting cities along the railroad, cities with a population of 8,000 or more. They had to be surrounded by good farmland, have a school and a church. And if they had a newspaper, they would send them a poster to be placed in their newspaper advertising that in 2 weeks they would be bringing children out. And of course the demand was for young boys, young strong boys. One thing that surprised me was also the demand for domestic help. And they said the reason was that women during those days, their lives were so hard that they aged fast and died young. And I say, look at some of your grandparents' pictures and you can see. They may have been 45 or 50 years old, look much older, So they would bring these children into the towns. Sometimes they took them out of jails, sometimes they took them off the streets, sometimes they took them off of orphanages. And at that time, you could be put in jail if you used profane language, if you smoked, if you walked along the railroad tracks, if you hung around bars or pool halls. And at one point they said approximately 500 boys were in jail between the ages of 7 and 15, but I found that two that were 5. So these children were taken from jail, whatever, and they would be placed on the trains. Some of the trains took 7 days to reach their destination. And so these children would be on the train for extended periods of time. Pat, would you get me a cup of coffee? I'm sorry. Some of these children would sleep on the seats, the younger ones. The older ones would sleep in boxcars. Summer, winter, whatever, they slept in the boxcars. There's a story of one little boy. I am so sorry. Wouldn't you know what I videotaped if I did this? There was one story of one little boy who his mother parted with him and was very, very upset about it. She wrote her name and her address, thank you very much, on a slip of pink paper and put it in her little boy's pocket. And he slept on the seat in the train, and when he woke up the next morning, it was gone. And the woman said, "You'll have no need for that where you're going." And so sometimes these kids never ever were able to reconnect with a family. Some of these children said that they lived on mustard sandwiches until they got to their destination. Some of the trains would stop and take on milk or fresh produce along the way. They would get to the towns and they would take the children to a public area, church, opera house, school, maybe just on the railroad siding, and you could come pick out a child. Like I said, the demand was for boys who could do heavy farm labor. There's a story of one little boy that was 10 years old and was not able to do the heavy-duty labor that the farmer that took him and wanted him to do. And so they traded him to the neighbor for a hog. Children at this time were valued for the amount of labor they could produce. This group would stay in town usually for 3 or 4 days and try to place as many children as they could. Go over some paperwork. Some places required them to fill out applications, some didn't. And then they would go on to the next town. And some of these stories that I've gotten were from diaries, from letters, from books, from personal interviews, and of course from the internet. There was one little girl, her name was Hazel. She remembers this, so I'm assuming she must have been at least 4 years old. She was sitting in a hotel room with her caretaker, and the caretaker said, stand up, Hazel, and meet your new daddy. And the little girl said, if you hit me, I'll never stand up. And she said her father bent down over her and said, I'll never hit you. I'll never hit you. And she said, you know what? He never did. He never did. So they're very, very touching stories, and there are some stories that made me absolutely livid. Like I said, some of these children, there was a parental role as well. And in one instance, there was a boy, I think he was 12, and he had a little sister who was like 3. And a young couple came and they picked out the little girl, but they didn't want him. And some of these children never saw their siblings again. Well, in this case, this boy was inconsolable. He cried and cried and cried. He thought he might never see his little sister again. But in the morning, the young couple came back and they said the little girl had cried all night for her brother, and so they took him to. There's a story of a little girl who had a problem with her hand. 2 fingers were joined and she had a hip problem. And she was, as they used to say in those days, slow. And typically back in those days, if you had a physical or a mental problem, you just got lost in the cracks. But this little girl was taken in and by a widow lady. It surprised me. I found a number of widows who took in children. And her friend said, what in the world were you thinking of taking in this child? And she said, the good Lord has given me the ability to give love to love to a child like this, and she's right where she needs to be. Because some of these children were shunned because they might have bad blood. There's a story of one little girl. She was walking home from school with a friend, and as they got within sight of this little friend's house, the mother yelled out the screen door, get away from her, I told you never talk to her. And the little girl said, I always wondered why I never got invited to the birthday parties. Bad blood. As I said, some of these kids never saw their siblings again. I have one remarkable story about Bill Sager. I don't know, you may have heard of Bill Sager if you've done any Orphan Train reading. Bill and his brother Arthur they lived in New York. Their mother passed away. Bill was 3, Arthur was 6. And their father placed Arthur, the 6-year-old, with his grandmother and put Bill, the 3-year-old, in the orphanage. Now this is another thing that surprised me. People gave away the little kids first, the smallest. And I'm thinking, wouldn't you want to keep your toddler or your infant? But you know, they couldn't help support their family. So the little ones were given away first and they kept the older children. So Bill went to an orphanage. He was in the orphanage for 5 years. At 8, he was put on the orphan train, and he came west, and he wound up in Makokata, Iowa. Never saw his brother again for 85 years. 85 years after they were separated, Arthur Nelson, who now lives in New Jersey, gets a phone call. And this lady said, are you Arthur Nelson? He said, yes. She said, do you have a brother? He said, yes, I do. And he gave Bill's name and birthday. And she said, would you stay by your phone? That's my father. And they spoke every night. And then I have a picture. I brought along my book of my research in case we have any questions or something else you might want to see. But the granddaughter and her husband took Bill back to New Jersey, and these 2 brothers met again. Bill was 88 and Arthur was 91, and they got together again. It's just remarkable stories like that that just touch your heart. Another one of my famous stories was the story of, I call him Sam. And this is in the 1860s, and he's riding home on horseback, going back home, and he decides to swing by and see his friend, the neighbor, on the neighboring farm. And as he drives, you can tell we're in a modern time. As he rode into the farmyard, he sees these little children playing. They're all little blondes, and one little guy with dark hair. And they said, you can imagine the conversation. You know, like, where in the world did he come from? He was an orphan train child. And it was the end of the line. And if you were at the end of the line and you weren't taken by someone, you went back to the institution. So they decided to take this little boy. Sam talked his friend into giving him that little boy. It doesn't say how old he is or how old he was, but he said he tucked him under his jacket, and the little boy clung to him and fell asleep on the ride to his home. It was his wife's birthday. I know her name is Sarah. And here again, you can imagine the conversation. He walks in the house and says, honey, look what I brought you for your birthday. But the poignant part of the story is they had a baby boy that either died at birth or very shortly thereafter, and were told there would be no more children. And here was this little gift from God. And that boy did not know that they were not his biological parents until he was 30 years old, and his mother had passed away, and they started looking through her things. So some of these kids were aware they were adopted, some weren't. Some of these kids were indentured and some weren't. And when I think of indentureship, I think of like slavery. But actually, if you were indentured, there were certain legal rules that had to be met about your care. And if they weren't met, this institution could come and take that child back. And if you were indentured, you had some legal standing, because these children had no legal standing. Some of them didn't even know what their real name was. In my own family, we had a young boy, it was an infant, whose parents died in an epidemic. And he didn't know his real name until when he got married. He had to have his legal name, and he found his name. His name was House, but he was raised by the Cummins family. So we always called him Jesse House Cummins. And when you're doing some genealogy, be aware that the name you have may not be the correct name, of course. And if you're looking for baptismal records, look for them where they came from, not locally. There were some people who took in children who were very wealthy. And there was one wealthy widow who took in a child. I mean, she had an inside bathroom in the 1800s. Now, I mean, this is like, you know, Vanderbilt wealth. And she took in a boy and a girl, unrelated. And she had a boy and a girl. And her own children could use the inside bathroom. They had their own bedrooms. They played whenever they wanted to. These two little ones, I call them OTRs, Orphan Train Riders. The two little OTRs had to do all the work around the house. They had to roll a blanket out and sleep on the floor. And they had to use the outside privy. And a year later, when the little girl was 8, she either took like a piece of bread or a cookie from the pantry, something very minor, and was beaten severely for stealing food. So here's a child where you think, oh, they had, you know, look at this wonderful home. You know, they would have a wonderful life, but they didn't. There's also the story of 3 brothers and a sister. And their mother passed away. Father put them up for adoption. And many, many years later, the sister found the 2 brothers. They had gone back to New York. And she went back to New York and kept house for them. But they always wondered what happened to their little brother, Willie. So the young girl wrote to the institution and asked for information. And all they would tell her was that he was adopted by a very wealthy banking family and he had a wonderful education. Well, she wrote back again and she wanted to connect with him. And so they forwarded her letter to this young man. And this young girl received a letter back saying, you know, I don't want anything to do with him. She persisted. He wrote back again and sent a photograph with the photographer's name scratched out. And he said, you don't seem to understand. I do not want anything to do with you. She persisted, and she found him. Probably much to his chagrin, but she found him. But here's the story of maybe an orphan train rider who had too good a lifestyle. Someone here close by, and you know, they stopped all over this area, the trains did. And there was a couple in Polo who wanted a toddler, and it was very, very bitterly cold. And they were given this little bundle, obviously an infant, and they were afraid to open it up and see what it was because they were afraid whatever it was, it would catch pneumonia in this cold weather. So they took it home not even knowing what they had. They had a little Caucasian boy when they got there. And most of the first orphan train riders were from Western Europe, England, Germany, Ireland, because William Charles Warren Brace thought that the children from Western Europe were much superior to the kids from Eastern Europe. So the kids from Eastern Europe and some of your Native American and black children, they didn't come into the picture until much, much later. These children, and I found 231 in 17 states, 17 counties rather. I researched only those 17 counties in northwestern Illinois and the adjoining counties in Wisconsin and Iowa, thinking I might find some sibling across the line. But I found 231 initially. I'm finding more all the time. And once in a while, I'll get a little light bulb will go off, and I'm thinking, hey, I've got a match. I gave a program in Fulton here a few months back, and there was a gentleman there who was 100 years old, and he was, his dad was an orphan train rider, and he gave me a lot of information. He had a whole scrapbook for me to look at. But these kids went to every state in the Union, and no, like one lady asked me, they did not go to Hawaii or Alaska. I couldn't believe that she would ask me that. I thought, you better paddle mighty hard if you're going to get to Hawaii in the 1860s, 1870s. They went everywhere except Southern Illinois. A pastor took some children to Southern Illinois, and the people there became incensed when they found out that some were half orphaned. They had a living parent somewhere. And they ran him out of town and fined him $100, which back in those days was a lot of money. And so there were no children sent after that to Southern Illinois. As the cities in our area, the West, began to grow larger and larger, and the settlement of the West opened up more, some of our cities started having problems. And so they would send some of their children for the West. So gradually all of these kids did go to all states of the United States. The idea that some of these children were adopted was very repugnant to some of their parents, and they destroyed all their records. With the idea that I think that maybe they would want to go back and look up their parents again. So some of these children will have no idea, not be able to trace their parentage. Some would probably go back to some of the boys. I did find a few boys who ran away from farms. I didn't find any girls. I found some girls who were sent back because they liked the boys too much. But there were some boys who ran away. And typically back in those days, you couldn't get too far away, so they would change their names. So these kids will never be able to trace. There's a story of one boy who had been with a very strong German family, and he had a roof over his head, 3 squares, but there was not any emotional contact at all. And so at age 17, he decided he was leaving. And so he bundled up all of his clothes and threw them out of the upper story window, went downstairs, told him he was going to use the privy, and he left. And when I started doing my research, one of the first calls I got was from a lady in Humboldt, Texas, and I thought, how in the heck did you find me? Her brother, she was a family genealogist, her brother lived in Franklin Grove. She had traced her orphan train rider back to the Padrones. The Padrones were a mob in Italy in Italy, who would just grab children off the street and sell them. And so these kids will never be able to trace. But at least she knows that her orphan train rider was Italian, because some of these kids have no idea. It was funny because after a few years, the Catholics became very concerned that there might be Catholic children being put in Protestant homes. And so they began having a few orphan trains of their own. But if you were dropped off at a Catholic convent or school or church, you were baptized Catholic the next day, just to be on the safe side. And they also gave you your ethnicity. If you had reddish hair and green eyes, you were Irish. If you had olive complexion and dark hair, well, you must be Italian. So some people, in their investigation, might go back and find out that they're not really what they thought they were. But like I said, at least this gal that traced her ancestor back to the Patrones, at least she knew he was Italian. And as I said before, kids were valued for their labor. And so many of them were treated cruelly. There's one boy who was made to sleep in the barn year-round. He caught pneumonia and died. Because people only came into town, every couple months? Some of these kids were abused and it never became known. There was one boy who said he had made friends with a boy on the train, and that he happened to see him in town once in a while, and he never made eye contact, he never spoke to anyone. Said he knew he was being abused. So we get wonderful stories, we get sad stories. There was a complaint in the early 1870s from someone who lived in a boarding house. They heard a child being beaten a lot and crying a lot, and they reported it. A social worker went to the boarding house and checked and saw this little girl who was 5 years old. No, she wasn't. She was 9. She was suffering so much from malnutrition, she was stunted. She went to the authorities and said, "We've got to get this child out of this home." They said, "Sorry. We've got laws against cruelty to animals. We haven't got any laws against cruelty to children." The social worker persisted. They declared that little girl an animal and removed her from the home. And so a year later, in 1875, came the first laws against cruelty to children. Also during this period of time, we started getting an influx of a little different type of orphan train rider. And these were American kids. And these were a result of the Civil War, where we had a lot of young men killed and young women who could not support their children. And so we had American kids. And of course, this involved Native American kids, black kids, kids of all colors. In the 1880s came about a lot of change. So now we've got this, the bills against cruelty to children. And it became more aware to the public of the problems that we had. And more laws came into effect. There was a new law passed that every 2 years, these children in these poorhouses, or orphanages, whatever, had to be removed if they got over the age of 2 years. They also, the National Children's Bureau formed, and they researched all kinds of children's safety. Child labor laws came into effect. And because previous to this, some of these kids were put in a working situation where they worked 12 hours a day, 6 days a week. And so in the late 1880s, some huge changes came about. The government became more involved, and because of the Civil War and the loss of all of these young men, family values changed. Families became important. And so you also had kindergarten starting. You had places like Hull House, boarding houses where, you know, one group of women would maybe watch the children of another group while they worked or whatever. There began to be more involvement with children's care. And so the country was in transition. And the 1900s changes continued until, especially with the child labor laws, where these children had to be sent to school 9 months out of the year. Previously it was 4 months because they needed them for harvesting and planting. But now they had to leave them in school 9 months out of the year. Farmers didn't need them. It didn't meet their needs, although some of these kids never did go to school. Farmers never did let them go to school. But anyway, the need for these children was reduced. And finally, the Children's Aid Society and the New York Foundling Home closed. And this is something I should have said before. Some of these institutions had these horrible names. The New York Juvenile Asylum, the Home for the Little Wanderers, horrible names. And these children sometimes there were 2 women taking care of 200 children. It was hardly any place for a child to reach their full capability. Now, I often wonder at the intellect that we've lost with these children. 2 of these children became governors of their state, Alaska and North Dakota. They were 2 boys. They'd ridden out on the train together, became friends, but were separated and went their way then later, became governors. George Mitchell, who knows who George Mitchell is, or was? He was a Senate Majority Whip. He was asked by President Clinton to be on the Supreme Court. He deferred. And I think George Mitchell is the true American story. His father was an Irish orphan train rider who was taken in by a Lebanese immigrant couple. And when George was born, he married a German immigrant. And I'm thinking, this is a neat story. I can imagine a little Irishman being raised by 2 Lebanese parents. And you know, there's another story of a little boy. He was 5, who came into this country. His parents had died on the ship on the way over, and he spoke only German. He was 5 years old, didn't speak the language, and had no one here. The strength that these kids showed. I mean, they formed a backbone of what our society is in this area today. And they say that about 5% of the population carries orphan train rider blood. So when I look out here, I'm thinking at least one of you has got orphan train rider blood. And sometimes stories come down to the family that the child was adopted. Typically they weren't, they were taken in or indentured. Sometimes, because these children were shunned, they never told. That story was never passed on. They were orphan train riders. There's a story of one family. The father was an orphan train rider, and he never told his children. But after his death, their mother told them. So you may have some people back in your family, and the story has been buried. The story's been buried. These children went to sod huts, they went to mansions, they went to little apartments above stores. They were taken in by the wealthy and the poor. They went to all 48 states. And in 1929, the last of the orphan trains went to Texas with 3 boys. They were the last orphan train riders. This was the largest child migration in the history of the world. And the estimates vary from 150,000 to 250,000. And I know just from the New York Juvenile Asylum, they placed over 5,000 children in Illinois alone. It's a remarkable story of our history, and when I kind of stumbled on this, I thought this is something that we don't usually hear about. But it's such a remarkable part of our history. And I keep getting information. I said, I told my children, just throw my research in the casket with me. And I said, nah, it'll probably burn. But I'll continue doing this forever. And I keep getting new information. And I just got something not long ago. Bless their hearts, the people at the society. Sometimes when they're doing research and they run across something, they'll copy it for me. And this was a young orphan boy, 11 years old, who was adopted from an orphan asylum in Chicago by S.G. Hunter of Amboy, was killed at the Hunter farm Saturday morning. He was run over by a pulverizer and bled to death out in the field. I'm always looking for more kids. I've got another one, the Grow Herrings, and I happened to meet a Grow Herring in Fulton, and he gave me a lot of information, so I'm always looking for stuff. If you have any information on orphan train writers, I'm always glad to get it, always glad to get it. I have a number of handouts up here on where to send applications. If you need more information, the application form, just a list of the Lee County orphan train writers that I'm aware of, and there's several lists. Some of them are a little different than the others. Some of them are have misspellings. I copied them exactly as I found them. But typically, if we're aware, it gives their name, their date of birth, the family they were placed with, the year they were placed, and the city where they lived. So you're all welcome to come up and get something. If you have any questions or any comments, I'm always glad to field them. Any questions or comments? When I don't get any questions, I think, geez, I did a good job.
What would you think the approximate number who came, say, to Dixon on the Northwestern or the Illinois Central trains that crisscrossed it?
How many of the trains or how many of the kids?
How many of the kids would you guess over many years?
Oh my gosh, Craig. I don't know if I ever found that. I found 31 in Lee County, 32 in Whiteside. Like I say, I found 231, but I found more since. But they're all around us. Wonderful, wonderful part of our history. Any other questions?
Carol?
Yes.
What, the peak home up by Polo, were they involved at all with the orphan train?
You know, the question is, was the peak home up by Polo involved? And, you know, this is something I want to do some research on. I have not done it yet. But I think most of these children were involved in direct placement. And I think those children were mostly local children. But I'm amazed at what these kids accomplished. And you know, a large majority went into social work. They became teachers, pastors. Some of them went back and worked at the institutions from which they were placed. Research shows that 87% of the placements were considered successful, but I never found the criteria that determined what successful meant. Was it a roof over your head, 3 squares a day, and clothes? I have no idea. I have no idea. It's a fascinating subject, and like I said, I'll be studying this till I become a vegetable. Yes, John?
Would Dixon have been the only town large enough in Lee County for the train to stop then, or were there other towns?
No, no. And the thing that makes it hard to research sometimes is these kids, a lot of times when they got to this town of 8,000, they spread out. There's some kids that had a full day buggy ride getting to where they were. But one of the fun parts of this research too is finding these towns that I've never heard of. And going to these towns, I had never heard of Foley, Illinois. There were a few kids placed there, and I went there, it's 12 houses and a church, 7 miles off the hard road. So it's a fascinating thing to study.
Carol?
Yes.
I know they came to Amboy because I've seen ads in the Amboy News
Mhm.
where they were
Yeah.
gonna be at a certain hotel or a certain
Yeah.
place, and you could come and pick out your child.
Yeah. It's, can you imagine what these kids went through? Either from an alcoholic home, an abusive home. There was one home where the dad murdered the mother. And then living on the streets, and then being put in a train and taken, you have no idea where, you have no control over it. But if this child did not want to go with the person who wanted them, they didn't have to. There's a story of one little boy, I think he was 4, and this disgusting looking gentleman picked him out. He was dirty, and he came up and he put his fingers in this little boy's mouth, because they checked their teeth and felt their muscles. And anyway, he stuck his finger in this little boy's mouth, and the little boy kicked him in the shin. And the old guy says, "I want this kid." And he said, "No, you're not. It's not cool." Very, very few of the placements were unsuitable. Like I said, there was one group, and there were 3 sisters who were all sent back gradually because they liked the boys too much. Interesting part of our history. Any other questions or comments?
I think it would have been very heartbreaking to be, come off the train and not be chosen time after time. What did that do to their?
Yeah, and if they got to the end, they were sent back. There was one other story too that I heard, and I had this wonderful scenario in my mind. An orphan train rider was taken in by a family that already had 12 children. And I thought, isn't that wonderful? They probably said, "What's one more?" And then I got a call a couple years ago from a lady in Whiteside County who was researching her husband's grandmother, who was an orphan train rider, who was taken in by a family that already had 12 children, who was impregnated by the husband shortly after she got there, at age 14. Delivered a child at 15, was forced to marry this guy's youngest son, and had a horrible life. And so this wonderful family situation, I thought, and I don't know if it was the same one, but it's pretty strange. It's in the same county. It's an orphan train rider, adopted by a family with 12 children. I mean, everything kind of points to it. Any other questions? Like I say, I've got a lot of handouts up here, and I brought my research with me. So if there are any questions you might have that I might be unaware of, I can look them up for you. Anyway, thanks for coming tonight.